What's going on, everybody? This is the second episode of Agitprop, short for agitative propaganda. We are live from the den of sin, the epicenter of cultural imperialism. Of course, I'm referring to sunny Los Angeles, California. I'm your host, Hasan Piker. This is going to be an episode where I finally do some hosting, and I'm genuinely terrified. I'm just letting you guys know ahead of time that it might be kind of bad, okay? I'm only used to doing this on Twitch, where I get to do whatever I want, and it's not as structured as an actual show. The second episode is actually gonna be jam-packed with a lot of goodies. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about Agitprop, what the word means. That's gonna be the first segment, and then I will be joined by one of my favorite people on the internet, good friend of mine, Felix Biederman, host of the very successful Chapo Trap House podcast, a New York Times best-selling author. What crazy, a PogChamp, a guy who is basically sniper Chris Kyle, 3 tours in Fortnite, just an absolute lad. We're gonna be talking to him about Russiagate, the conspiracy mindset of liberal boomers, the conspiracy mindset of Republican boomers. Then we're also going to talk about my favorite, not conspiracy, real situation, Epstein-gate, the death or potentially murder of Jeffrey Epstein, the billionaire pedophile. And finally, we're gonna wrap it up with an article on Colette magazine, which is my favorite race science phrenology magazine out there, and how they got owned by a real leftist who was posing as a fake leftist. So without further ado, let's get started. I'll also be doing something very different that other people don't do, that my producer is going to freak out over right now, but I will be going through the live comments. So that's why I like to do a little bit more engagement than other shows, so I'm just letting you guys know I will be checking all of the terrible things you're saying in the comment section. All right, so let's get started. What is Agitprop? What is Agitprop, Hasan? Why did you name the show Agitprop? So let's go to the first graphic here. Agitprop, abbreviated from Russian agitatsiya propaganda, agitation propaganda, is a political strategy in which the techniques of agitation and propaganda are used to influence and mobilize public opinion. Although the strategy is common, both the label and obsession with it were specific to the Marxism practiced by communists in the Soviet Union. Ironically, this is from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I would consider to be Western imperialist propaganda. But Lenin had some stuff to say about Agitprop in What Is to Be Done in 1902. He said, struggle can also be transformed into agitation. Take the example of a picket line. Basically, it is a form of struggle, but it contains agitation, including slogans on the picket signs. Of course, the picket signs themselves can be transformed into a form of struggle when appropriately used to knock some scab or cop upside the head. And this, in turn, is a form of education for any fellow pigs and low-life scabs in the vicinity. Basically, the short and sweet of it is, there's a lot to be angry about, unless you're Tim Ryan and your campaign slogan is, why are you yelling? But as Bernie Sanders effectively put it, there is a lot to be angry about right now. But unfortunately, I feel like a lot of people in America don't know where to put that anger. They don't know where to transfer that energy because there's not a lot of class consciousness in this country. And I think that that is absolutely deliberate. So this show is basically going to be a leftist take, a more leftist approach to all of the comings and goings, the daily monotony, and sometimes outright brutality of our news cycle, and I will be telling you exactly why the levers in power, or those in positions of power who control us, the real masters, who the real masters are, which I would consider to be capital, and why the system is designed the way that it is to make you feel the way that you do, which is hopeless, senseless, and kind of falling in a vacuum and alienated. So Agitprop was used throughout time, specifically by the USSR. Soviet anti-racism campaigns were essential to the regime's conceptualization on its own political and moral identity. It is hard to think of any other issue where the Soviet Union's moral superiority over its Western opponents was as incontrovertible as when it came to contrasting their respective histories of engagement with Africans and their descendants. So agitative propaganda, especially as a fighting force against the United States, was effectively utilized during the civil rights struggles, early era, like USSR rising. There are numerous American thinkers who have talked about their treatment under the USSR or by by communists, for example. W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, returned from his 1926 tour of the USSR, captivated by the human warmth and racial equality he claimed to observe there. If what I have seen with my own eyes and heard with my ears is Bolshevism, then I am a Bolshevik, he quipped. Now, there was a turn. But even before we get to that turn, when an all-white jury falsely convicted 9 black teenagers of rape in Scottsboro, Alabama in 1931, the USSR's International Red Aid, IRA, organized an international campaign to liberate the Scottsboro boys. Now, this was a perfect example of this, and that's part of the reason why you would see, even during the civil rights struggle in the 60s, that people oftentimes, like Republicans and even some liberals, or the famously called out white moderate, would routinely say commies and also people who are like fighting in the civil rights movement to get out of this country. Communism and the anti-war effort and democratic socialism and the civil rights efforts were intertwined, basically. People, of course, understood that they weren't directly linked to one another, but oftentimes this was regarded as a class struggle where people considered themselves to be perfect allies. Now, this is very similar to what we see in this day and age. But before we get to that, by the 1940s and 50s, the Soviet Union, a country that preached and occasionally practiced the principles of internationalist solidarity, had given to a more traditional nation state dominated by the ethnic Russian majority. At this point, the KGB Agitprop started focusing on both sides of internal conflict that existed in the United States to exploit division in the United States and agitate as best as they could. This is a little bit more similar to what we see during the Russiagate era of Russian propaganda, where both sides of a Black Lives Matter conflict can oftentimes be, our media outlets will talk about Black Lives Matter and how Russians were instigating BLM movements. There was an organization in, I forget which area it was in the United States, where there was a scare propped up by Facebook ads in regards to Muslim immigration. But then on the other side, there was also another agitation happening in regards to Islamophobia in the area and white nationalism. And that's pretty much what started happening in the 60s and 70s. But my main point here is the fact that these issues have not changed. Obviously, even if you don't care about like civil liberties or equality or fighting for equity because you care about your fellow men and women and fellow citizens, then the least you can do is care about it from, I don't know, maybe like a national security perspective, considering the fact that America is basically a powder keg and it's so easily influenced and exploited by foreign adversaries who want to change political outcomes or who want to make us fight amongst ourselves. Why don't we focus on actually solving these issues? That's what I'm here to talk about, basically. Anyway, so let's get to contemporary agitprop. Like the Internet Research Agency, the earlier IRA planned protests, distributed news and political materials, and adopted the rhetoric of American activists, masking the true foreign source of their campaign. Many American observers credited the post-trial wave of protests, some orchestrated by the IRA, others more spontaneous, with pressuring the Alabama Supreme Court to agree to hear the defendants' appeal. Though Southern conservatives typically denounced civil rights activism as communist, the general public understood the Scottsboro campaign in the context of ongoing anti-Jim Crow advocacy, not Soviet interference. So obviously there were still people who considered this to be just regular like civil rights struggle. In the 1960s, just as the propaganda arm of the Soviet Union was highlighting racism in the US, the KGB attempted to discredit Martin Luther King Jr. by portraying him as an Uncle Tom who was secretly receiving government subsidies. Similarly, in 2016, some IRA Twitter accounts mimicked the rhetoric of the Black Lives Matter movement, while others broadcasted right-wing nativist messages. I mentioned this already. Russian trolls even organized the protest and simultaneous counter-protest of the opening of an Islamic center in Houston, taking advantage of American Islamophobia. Now, you might be thinking at this point, Hasan, what is this? Is this pro-Russian propaganda? What are you doing? No, of course not. I would also urge you to look into foreign interference in other nations in their democratic elections in the hands of the US State Department or the CIA. This is something that the United States has been engaging in for a very long time. We're very good at it. The United States' departure from democratic ideals sometimes went much further. The CIA helped overthrow elected leaders in Iran and Guatemala in the 1950s and backed violent coups in several other countries in the 1960s. It plotted assassinations and supported brutal anti-communist governments in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So we like to think about Russia as a foreign adversary or the USSR as this like totally villainous nation, and it's completely understandable. Part of it is also the Red Scare. Part of it is Western media propaganda. It's easy to scapegoat a foreign adversary and blame them for all of our internal struggles or internal problems. But the reality is we've done much, much worse things all around the world. Obviously, I'm not here to defend the USSR. I'm not a fan of the USSR. But, you know, the United States, not great. Our track record, not exactly stellar when considering the fact that even someone like Elliot Abrams, for example, still has a place in this government trying to facilitate a peaceable transitional government offered to Guaido, who is an American puppet, essentially, who wants to privatize all of Venezuela's extraction industries. This guy was played a significant role in previous administrations in covering up massacres that the United States engaged in. So, you know, we have a lot to blame. We've done a lot of terrible things, okay? Just reminding you guys of that.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.